right to have access to particular government information or to require openness from the bureaucracy. The public's interest in knowing about its government is protected by the guarantee of a free press, but the protection is indirect. The Constitution is neither a Freedom of Information Act nor an Official Secrets Act. Happily, the Constitution is not the only source of rights and privileges. Legislative bodies are free to classify groups of people as having privileges not applicable to the public at large, as long as those privileges do not deny someone a right guaranteed by the Constitution. Which brings us to the Freedom of Information Act. The act was approved by Congress in 1966 to require government agencies to make records available for inspection and copying by the press and the public. The press gets a few special privileges under the act, including expedited review of its records requests and relief from fees for searching and copying that others have to pay. But by and large, the press and the public have roughly equal rights to inspect records held by executive branch agencies, including the military, the Federal Communications Commission, the Environmental Protection Agency, and many others. Congress exempted itself from the act, as well as the courts, but both Congress and the courts have long traditions of openness, and the Supreme Court has made an exception to its general reluctance to find a constitutional mandate for openness when it comes to the judiciary. The Freedom of Information Act was passed after a lengthy effort by various members of the press and others, reacting to what they saw as a sharp increase in government secrecy after World War II. The invention of the atomic bomb and the vast expansion of the government's size and power before and during the war made it much harder to find out what the government was doing. There was more to hide, and it was easier to hide it. Congress debated the wisdom of an act to give the public a right to inspect records for more than a decade before sponsors were able to get the votes together to pass the law. Even then, it is said that President Lyndon Johnson signed the bill with one hand holding his nose because he feared that all of that mandated openness would cause all sorts of trouble. From the beginning, the Freedom of Information Act has caused a certain amount of ambivalence both within the government and within the press. Government officials complain that the act requires too much information to be made public and that Congress failed to attach any additional funding to the act, meaning that agencies had a new requirement but no extra money to comply with it. The press has complained that agencies are too slow to comply with the act and that too much information is being held back and that agencies stall in releasing records and hope that the media will lose interest. There have been reports over the years of Freedom of Information Act requests gathering dust for years before they were dealt with, and often the end result was a rejection or a heavily edited document. Perhaps because of these problems, estimates suggest that only about 20% of all Freedom of Information Act requests actually come from journalists, who often cannot wait weeks, months, or years for information to be released. Part of the problem has been the 9 exemptions included in the Freedom of Information Act and the conflicting messages that they send to agencies. Several of the exemptions are tied to protecting the privacy of government employees, corporations, and members of the public who have given medical or financial information to the government in return for aid or as part of the tax-paying process. The Supreme Court wrestled with the privacy versus disclosure issue in 1989 when it determined that compilations of criminal histories maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation were exempt from disclosure under privacy protection exemption for law enforcement records, even though the individual records of arrests and convictions were public. The court wrote that the FOIA's central purpose is to ensure that the government's activities be open to the sharp eye of public scrutiny, not that information about private citizens that happens to be in the warehouse of government be so disclosed. This conception of the central purpose of the Freedom of Information Act probably would have come as a great surprise to the people who wrote the act, who did not state that it had such a central purpose. The Supreme Court's decision was consistent with its general tendency to interpret the exemptions in the Freedom of Information Act broadly while interpreting its central purpose narrowly. The court has never really explained its reasoning in regard to those matters, but there is some good news. Congress in 2008 amended the Freedom of Information Act to make it easier for the press and the public to receive information. They broadened the definition of journalists to include those who produce news for the internet. They made it harder for agencies to avoid paying attorneys' fees when they lose challenges to their decisions not to disclose. And they created a new agency to oversee compliance with the law. Earlier this year, the Supreme Court determined that corporations cannot claim that they have a personal privacy right to hold back information. And shortly after that, they also said that the Navy was interpreting an exemption for agency rules and memoranda too broadly when it denied records to citizens trying to find out what the Navy was storing in a facility near their homes. It should also be noted that despite the problems with the Freedom of Information Act, the press has uncovered a great deal of information over the years by using the law. And I know I'm out of time, but I need to give a few examples since this is a press-related panel. U.S. News and World Report magazine reported in 2000 that the government had bought the royalty rights to Adolf Hitler's Mein Kampf and had made thousands of dollars from sales of that infamous book before selling the rights back to an American publishing house, which continued to earn royalties from the book until the magazine exposed the practice. The publisher now donates the proceeds to various charities. In 2007, CBS News used the Freedom of Information Act and state access laws to uncover data revealing that suicides among people serving in the military or that who had recently left the military were skyrocketing, particularly among people ages 20 to 24 who had served in Iraq or Afghanistan. National Public Radio reported last year that the percentage of nursing home residents in the 31 to 64 age group had increased sharply since the year 2000 because of cuts in state programs for home health care and psychiatric hospitals, despite the fact that home health care is actually less expensive over time than nursing home care. And the New York Times reviewed federal records and uncovered a disturbing rise in violations of the Clean Water Act and weak enforcement of the law. The newspaper documented numerous instances of serious illnesses resulting from tainted water as a result of chemical or human waste pollution that often went unpunished. Alexander Hamilton was correct when he said that freedom of the press relied more on the spirit of the people and the government than on any constitutional provisions. Likewise, Potter Stewart was correct when he said that the First Amendment set up a contest between the press and the government but did not declare a winner. The press must be eternally vigilant here as well as in the United States to make sure that secrecy is the exception when it comes to government action and not the norm. Chile's passage of the transparency law demonstrates that Chileans share with Americans a high regard for the principles of self-government and its partnership with freedom of expression and inquiry. A free press without the ability to gather and report on information of interest to the people is, to quote Madison, a prologue to a farce or a tragedy. Chile has chosen to avoid that tragedy. The press will no doubt test the resolve of government officials to respect the right that the law creates to inspect records. But an uninhibited, robust, and wide-open debate about public issues and public officials is a sign of a healthy democracy. Anything less is, again to quote Madison, a farce. Thank you.
A continuación sigue Pedro Ramírez, periodista de CIPER Chile.
Desde la promulgación de la Ley de Transparencia, CIPER ha presentado cerca de 240 solicitudes de acceso a información pública. Nuestra experiencia en relación a la calidad de las respuestas ha sido bastante variada, desde la colaboración entusiasta de los funcionarios que han sido capacitados para responder solicitudes de acceso en pequeños municipios y que reciben con suerte una solicitud al semestre y que por lo tanto se manifiestan alegres cuando uno llega a pedirles algo, colaboran con felicidad y sobre colaboran en realidad, hasta entidades que no nos responden dentro del plazo legal, así de sencillo. El último caso que enfrentamos fue hace muy poquito, hace un par de semanas. El Servicio de Impuestos Internos no nos dio respuesta dentro del plazo legal cuando consultamos sobre el ingreso irregular de camiones que había ingresado a la empresa Cencosud como ayuda humanitaria para damnificados por el terremoto y que terminaron siendo comercializados dentro del país. Yo quisiera iniciar esta exposición citando un ejemplo reciente y sorprendente. Hace algunos días el Ministerio de Educación, el ministro Lavín, dio a conocer los resultados de la prueba Inicia, que mide los conocimientos de los egresados de las carreras de pedagogía. El ministro entregó los resultados acompañándolos de un ranking de las instituciones de educación superior que imparten las carreras de pedagogía y que se sometieron al examen. CIPER había pedido en septiembre pasado los resultados de ese examen, divididos por alumnos y por establecimientos educacionales. La respuesta del Ministerio a nuestra petición fue negativa, basándose en que la publicación de los resultados, y cito entre comillas, afectaría los derechos económicos y comerciales tanto de los alumnos como de las universidades, porque conllevaría necesariamente a la construcción de un ranking de las instituciones por parte de los usuarios de la información, y que ese ranking, comillas, estadísticamente no sería válido, porque compara poblaciones con distinto nivel de representatividad y además porque la prueba realizada solo midió un aspecto de la formación docente y no todos sus ámbitos. O sea, el ranking que nos entregó el ministro Lavín la semana pasada no es válido. Acá tenemos un ejemplo en que la institución pública, primero, supone un uso específico por parte del demandante de la información. O sea, quien recibe la solicitud, la entidad, supone que el que la está pidiendo va a construir un ranking. Y la ley no tiene contemplado que la entidad se pregunte ¿para qué estamos pidiendo la información? ¿Cierto? La ley no le pide a la entidad que nos pregunte a nosotros para qué deseamos la información. No puede suponer cuál es el destino. Y si se hace finalmente un mal uso de la información, existen los tribunales para que ahí, ¿no es cierto?, si hay alguna querella, alguna demanda por injuria, calumnia, difamación, por mal uso de la información, se ventile ahí, que es donde corresponde, y no donde un funcionario decide que no sabe, parece que usted va a hacer mal uso de la información, así que no se la voy a entregar. Nosotros ya habíamos enfrentado una situación similar en la pugna larga que tuvo CIPER con la Fundación Futuro por las memorias y balances de esa corporación. Nosotros las obtuvimos después de 17 meses de presentada la solicitud tras un fallo de la Corte de Apelaciones. Los abogados de la Fundación Futuro establecieron que nosotros queríamos hacer un uso político de la información debido a que su presidente es Sebastián Piñera. El fallo de la Corte señaló que no puede limitarse la transparencia solo por, comillas, el mero carácter preventivo respecto de un eventual mal uso de la información. En torno al caso del Ministerio de Educación que les comentaba al comienzo, una arista curiosa es que en enero de este año el Consejo para la Transparencia resolvió a favor del Ministerio el amparo que CIPER presentó para acceder a los antecedentes de la prueba Inicia. En una extensa decisión que le tomó al Consejo 14 carillas impresas, se enumeraron las normas y criterios legales que amparaban la decisión del Ministerio de mantener bajo reserva esta información, porque el ranking sería estadísticamente inválido y provocaría daño a las instituciones y los estudiantes evaluados. 3 meses después de ese extenso fallo del Consejo, el ministro Lavín entregó su ranking y dio a conocer la información que nosotros habíamos pedido. Entonces, nosotros nos formulamos una pregunta que es válida para el Consejo respecto de las funciones que él tiene, en el sentido de que, ¿qué pasa cuando una entidad decide mantener bajo reserva los documentos para no estropear una estrategia comunicacional? O sea, nosotros, amparados por la ley y en los plazos que corresponden, solicitamos la información y la entidad no nos entrega, se ampara en ciertos argumentos, pero finalmente lo que está haciendo es dándole prioridad a los propios plazos en los cuales ella quiere entregar la información de acuerdo a su estrategia comunicacional o los dividendos políticos que le puedan retribuir a la autoridad, en este caso, entregar esta información. Ahí tenemos, a nuestro juicio, un vacío en el marco legal y le preguntamos al Consejo, ¿qué se puede hacer en este caso? ¿A quién se le reclama? ¿Qué sanciones se aplican? ¿No? Por de pronto nosotros lo que hicimos fue hacer público esta situación en un artículo que publicamos la semana pasada, por lo menos para someter al Ministerio a la sanción moral de quienes nos leen habitualmente en nuestra página web. En el caso que enfrentó a CIPER con la Fundación Futuro, nosotros comprobamos que en general los balances y memorias que se entregan al Ministerio de Justicia son resúmenes sumarísimos de ingresos y gastos que no permiten fiscalizar efectivamente los movimientos financieros de las fundaciones y las corporaciones sin fines de lucro. Nos parece que es un asunto crítico, por cuanto estas entidades tienen la posibilidad de acceder a beneficios tributarios, por lo que obviamente los ciudadanos deben tener acceso a estos balances y a estas memorias.